Welcome to Firing Line. I'm Michael Kinsley of the New Republic magazine. This December marks the 200th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. We are also entering a period when the definition of those rights is in flux. On the Supreme Court, a self-confident conservative majority will be looking skeptically at the great flowering of constitutional rights over the past half-century. Mr. Buckley's guest is Ira Glasser, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU. Mr. Glasser has a new book called Visions of Liberty, The Bill of Rights for All Americans. It contains essays by himself on the major constitutional rights, illustrated with photographs by Bob Edelman. Mr. Buckley intends to concentrate today on the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom. Amazingly, the first Supreme Court case protecting the right of religious freedom didn't come until 1940, a century and a half after the Bill of Rights was enacted. Unlike other constitutional rights, this one is double-edged. The Free Exercise Clause forbids the government to thwart religion, but the Establishment Clause forbids it to promote religion either. Attempting to negotiate between this Scylla and Charybdis has led the Supreme Court into some of its worst conceptual tangles. This year, the court must decide whether an invocation by a rabbi at a public high school graduation violates the Establishment Clause. Mr. Buckley, I know that what exercises you most is the ban on prayers in schools. I think the difficult question is going to be, as the court relooks at this, would you be satisfied with a moment of silence or some kind of anodyne, non-denominational prayer, or do you think it's necessary to go all the way to full-fledged, full-blooded, real sectarian religion in the public schools?
I think it's wrong to be asked, would I be satisfied with it? I mean, I wouldn't be satisfied with American society until you shut up. But that, my satisfaction simply can't be the governing axiom of our society. It seems to me that the very fact that it's a rabbi speaking that prayer rather than a priest or a Protestant divine suggests that the community wants a rabbi. Now, is he engaged in establishing a rabbinical America? Well, some people run scared, like your constituents, and pour money into your coffers so that you can scare them some more and try to say that this is a violation of the First Amendment. Am I correct?
No, but you're usually not correct, so nothing new about that. I think the issue with respect to public school prayer is simply this. It's not a question of whether anybody's afraid of establishing an official religion in the United States. It's a question of whether or not the government ought to be endorsing one religion and imposing it upon children and their parents.
Well, why did they find unconstitutional a prayer that satisfied the New York's rabbis, priests, and ministers in 1962?
Well, because they're not the only ones. You know, there was a teacher. No, that's right. There was a teacher in a kindergarten in a large American city last year who decided that the way to be fair and avoid the problem of appearing to have the government prefer one religion over another was to celebrate Hanukkah at the same time that she was celebrating Christmas. And then she got a very unhappy visit from a Muslim parent who was from Libya and didn't like his kids coming home singing Hanukkah songs. Now, you know, it may sound trivial to those of us who are in the majority, but religion, the idea in a public school, I'm not talking about a private school, is that the government ought simply not to be in the business of hindering or helping religion. It ought to just stay out of it. That's what religious freedom is about.
Another view of the situation is that a freedom ought to grant as many rights to a public school as possible. And since a private school can do what it likes on this subject, given its constituency, in fact, it is done by public schools. St. John, the Brooklyn College closes down on Hanukkah. Why? Because they're mostly Jewish. Now, if one were to say, you must close down on a holy day that corresponds with the calendar of every conceivable sect in the entire world, you'd never open them for any schooling, which might be an improvement, I don't know. But the fanatical interpretation of the ACLU, and taken in your otherwise readable book, is that that it is your holy responsibility to protect any human being from the normal pressures that he ought to identify with being a minority. Now, I'm a Catholic, I'm a minority, but it doesn't bother me at all that a Protestant version of the Bible might be used by somebody who says a blessing at an event.
Well, the fact that it doesn't bother you doesn't mean that that makes it okay. The issue really is who else it bothers and what ought the proper role of government to be. In another context, you have said that you supported affirmative action in the private sector,
yeah,
but opposed it in the public sector because, after all, the public sector was the government. And one has to be sensitive to what the government is doing in a different way than one has to be sensitive to what the private sector is doing.
If you're denying a right, but you are in the business of right proliferation.
No.
If a week goes by the ACLU hasn't discovered a right, you think of yourself as irresponsible and slothful.
Well, that's what eternal vigilance is about, you know, and as long as there's folks like you running around, God knows.
Well, but the point is, somewhere along the line, it was discovered that the First Amendment to the Constitution forbids common prayer. You haven't gotten around to applying it to the Congress of the United States or the Supreme Court.
Well, it's not a matter of what we're applying. It's a matter of, you know, there was almost no issue, as you know, that inflamed the early Americans, the original citizens of this country, more than the cause of religious liberty. And the reason for that is that they were basically English citizens who had come over here with a rich history of being oppressed because of their religious views whenever the government got to have some power and combine that state power with religious power. I mean, so much so that you know, you didn't have public schools in colonial times, so it's impossible to say what anybody back then would have thought. But in 1752, for example, the Church of England established a school in New York financed with public funds, and it created a tremendous uproar. There were pamphleteering, there was revolt, there was a tremendous commotion. And it may surprise you, it was entirely without the ACLU. The ACLU wasn't around then. You know, people really cared that the government uses its power to favor someone else's religious views and impose it on them. Why is that hard to understand?
Well, in the first place, if you want to reach back to the 18th century, you've got to give it some sort of historical perspective. 1752 was almost exactly 100 years after Cromwell was tumbled, and Cromwell was a local version of Torquemada. The 17th and the 18th, and right up to the 18th century, there was vigorous prosecution of dissenting religious opinions. The Jews weren't enfranchised in Great Britain until 1842. The Catholics went until 1832. So it was in reaction to enormities of that kind that the incident you talk of happened. But when we got around to formulating a Bill of Rights, we had a very simple clause in it. You can't establish a religion. This didn't prevent the 13 states from proceeding to subsidize religion in general. And right up until quite recently, it was thought perfectly proper to do so. And there's Supreme Court decisions that justify that. It is only relatively recently that you have interpreted the establishment of religion as denying to a community the right to ask for religious auspices, for instance, for starting the school day.
No, you make an important historical mistake, though. The reason why the federal Constitution, though it prohibited the establishment of religion, did not seem to interfere with the power of states to go on subsidizing.
It hadn't been incorporation.
The Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states. The Bill of Rights was only back then was only applied to the federal government. And it was not until after the Civil War that it even arguably applied to the states, and it was not really until the 1960s that the Supreme Court ever did it.
Nice try. But the authors of the Bill of Rights, returning to their own states, playing a dominant role in the politics of their own states, did not raise any objection.
Wrong. Also wrong.
There was one business about Thanksgiving in Madison.
James Madison in 1784, in his home state of Virginia, vigorously opposed a bill which would have provided for the taxation to support a church, even on non-preferential grounds, and not just preferring religion, without preferring one sect over another sect. And when he did so, entirely consistent with the words of the First Amendment, which he was to write some 5 years later. When he did so, people got up on the floor of the Virginia legislature and accused him of being anti-religion. And he said that he was not anti-religion. He said that religion fared better when the government stayed out of it. Now, that might have been an ACLU speech if there was an ACLU there at the time, but you cannot say that that the ACLU was sort of out of whack with the founding fathers.
Why did President James Madison, 22 years later, authorize Thanksgiving as a very specific and in those days unmistakably partisan ceremony?
Well, presidents have a way when they have power of changing their position.
I mean, you like the early Madison rather than later
Madison.
Madison.
You like the Madison who was out of power. It is always true that when you have power, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, was far less a good civil libertarian than before. Thomas Jefferson thought that the court should be independent, for example, otherwise you could not enforce the Bill of Rights. He thought that when he was an ambassador to France, writing his friend James Madison.
Until time came to name justices.
Until the time came to him to be president, and then he thought that the president ought to have the power to remove justices if he disagreed with them.
You talk about human inconsistency, but human inconsistency hardly accounts for the Supreme Court up until the late 40s thinking it was perfectly tolerable, that which now you scream and yell about, nor have you accounted for the fact that every day when Congress opens, it opens with a prayer. God knows what it would do without that prayer.
Who knows?
I say God knows.
Oh. Well, you're a private person. You can say that, and I'll defend your right to say it. But look, it is true that the court did not.
Even Unitarians believe there's most one God.
That's right. It's true that the court did not until the late 40s, actually until the early 60s, really, apply much of the Bill of Rights to the states. But that's not just true about the religion clauses. That's not just true about the First Amendment. That's true about virtually everything. The fact of the matter is that the Supreme Court mostly didn't apply the Bill of Rights in any of its aspects. It didn't apply it to women. It didn't apply it to blacks. It didn't apply it to free speech. As late as the 1920s, the Supreme Court had never upheld a single claim of free speech.
Well,
so, the fact that the court wasn't much good during those years is not particular to the religion clause.
It's easy enough to say 125 years ago there weren't any blacks who weren't slaves. 55 years ago there weren't any women who could vote. We can, I think, exercise our intelligence with enough confidence to trace a natural and an unnatural evolution. Some people who call themselves feminists are extending the so-called rights of women to a fanatical extent. Some people who call themselves fans of the Bill of Rights are extending them to a fanatical extent. My point is that you are extending the First Amendment to a fanatical extent by misinterpreting the Establishment Clause as something that should protect the stray Muslim from having his feelings hurt because they read from the Old Testament.
By the government, yes, by the government. Not by you, and not by me, but by the government. And it trivializes that hurt to say it the way you do. And it's not, you see, it's not just that there were slaves back then. In 1873, the Supreme Court ruled in a case involving a woman named Myra Bradwell that although she was a graduate of a law school and the editor of an esteemed legal newsletter, she could not be admitted to the bar in the state of Illinois. And the Supreme Court said she could not be admitted to the bar in the state of Illinois because a woman's place was in the home bearing children and not being lawyers.
Now,
why did the Supreme Court say that?
That isn't quite what it say that.
That is what it said. Quite explicitly.
In the first place, that was an obiter dictum. And the reasoning was that they had no right to interfere with the Illinois Bar Association, which made its own rules.
And the reason for that was is that the women's appropriate place.
Well, you're saying what motivated people in defining the role of women 100 years ago? And I say you're quite right. They were thought of as primarily people responsible for motherhood.
Well, but the point is, that's right. But the point is that the Supreme Court, throughout its history, if you take the position, as I do, that the role of the Supreme Court, and as Jefferson did when he first suggested that to his friend James Madison in the 18th century, that the role of the Supreme Court was to use the Bill of Rights as a bulwark against excessive government action that interfered with rights. The fact is that the Supreme Court for most of its history, perhaps with the exception of the last 30 years, has acted to reflect majoritarian oppression and not to curb it. And it's done that with blacks, it's done it with women, and it's done it with minority religions, and it's done it with minority political views.
Well, I deny that it is a right of a Christian student at Brooklyn College to object to the closing of that college on Hanukkah, since it's overwhelmingly Jewish.
They don't close on Hanukkah, they close on Rosh Hashanah, but that's a,
well,
your point is the same.
Whatever it is.
Yes.
Now, I deny that one has a right to interpose with the majority when they are seeking perfectly healthy spiritual expressions of
No,
their
but
faith.
that's really a different issue. And by flipping back and forth between whether or not a public school can organize and impose a prayer session on people who don't share beliefs in that which is being prayed to,
Well, when you
it's
close
a different
the
issue.
whole school,
No, I'll tell you why it's
you're certainly
different.
proselyting in a sense.
It's like the Sunday closing laws. The reason I went to school at a time in New York City where the schools were not closed in those days. And what began to happen is that when people stayed out, when enough of the populace, both of the students and the teachers, were Jewish and stayed out on those holidays, there weren't enough people there to make the school worth staying open those days, for the same reason that that shops close on Sunday, for the same reason that that we're closed on Christmas. Nobody has ever claimed that when you close a school on Christmas, it's an establishment of religion. The fact of the matter is that so many people celebrate that day, and so many people remove themselves from work and from school, that it doesn't make any sense to stay open. That's a very different issue than whether or not the school ought to be imposing your prayer on me.
It's a different issue if you pose it in that way. But that's not the sensible way to pose it.
Sure it is.
The sensible way to pose it is that Christmas began as a religious holiday, even though it was established as recently as a few months ago that in England, 50% of the people don't know the origin of Christmas. Nevertheless, they sort of dimly know there's a manger involved and a little baby. Well, here too. Now, to suggest that you would boycott a school if it stayed open on Christmas Day is hypothetical, unprovable, and kind of silly, isn't it?
No, it's not a question of a boycott. It's a question
you say, well, why would it open if nobody attends it?
Well, it's because if people are observing a religious holiday, and if you allow them to observe a religious holiday by not punishing them for it, which I think you and I would both agree is the proper course for the government to take, then, and if enough people stay out on that holiday, then it may not be practical to keep it open anymore. If two people stay out, you do keep it open.
You're in the business of preserving individual rights, are you not? Why shouldn't I say, I have the right to have my teachers teach me, since after all I'm paying taxes for that service. And the fact that all these odd Christians out here want to stay out of school on Christmas Day is their business. I demand that the schools stay open, that janitor services, that the elevators stay open, and so on and so forth. Why wouldn't I have that right?
Why wouldn't you have the right to have the schools open on Sunday or Saturday?
Well,
because the law says that the schools have to stay open a certain number of days a year. And as long as they are, your rights are satisfied.
I'm asking what motivates the law. And what motivates the law is obviously the observance of a holiday. Now, you haven't got around to discussing the prayers that are said when Congress is open. Is that uncomfortable subject? As a matter of fact, you're campaigning against that, aren't you?
I'm campaigning against it?
Yeah.
Am I running for office? What do you mean, am I campaigning against it?
Well, the ACLU campaigns for all kinds of odd causes, and that's one of them, isn't it?
No, not particularly. That's not a live issue. I mean, it's not a live issue the way in God we trust on the currency is not a live issue.
Why isn't it?
I think it's not a live issue because everybody considers it too trivial. But let me ask you this question.
Because the last time you met, the majority of your directors didn't say, let's call it a live issue?
Pretty much.
Was it really a live issue?
Does anybody care about that issue now?
Well, there are always Mad Madeline O'Hare's around.
Right, but let me ask you a question. Supposing on a dollar bill, instead of in God we trust, it said, in our Lord Jesus Christ we trust. Would you think that that was the problem in constitutional terms?
No.
No?
Absolutely not.
You would lose.
Well,
you would not think that that was a problem in constitutional terms?
No, this is quote unquote a Christian country in the sense that the overwhelming majority of people in America are Christian.
And the First Amendment is designed to prevent that Christian majority from imposing its views and its beliefs on people who are not Christian.
But
that's what religious liberty means.
Why shouldn't the atheists have the right to deny them the use of the word God?
Exactly. That was why I asked you the question. What's different?
What's different is that you have put on your agenda. You haven't yet started your campaign against it.
I don't have any agenda except the same agenda that Madison and Jefferson had. The agenda is to protect religious liberty by keeping the government out of religion. It's real simple.
Yeah. You must really be kidding, because Jefferson and Madison both lived with and did not declaim against any number of practices which would be called unconstitutional. You can't even have a creche in a Rhode Island school now because you go crazy at the thought of all the intimidation that emanated from that creche.
Well, we don't go any crazier than the original Americans did when the slightest little suggestion that government was supporting religion caused tremendous uproar in the 18th century. That's where the First Amendment came from. I mean, I keep saying this, but the ACLU did not write the Establishment Clause.
What happened to the uproar between 1791 and 1948?
What happened between 1791 and the latter part of the 20th century was that during that time the Supreme Court enforced virtually none of the Bill of Rights. That's what I said before. The religion clauses were not unique. Those issues just never got dealt with by the Supreme Court, in part because most of them occurred at the state level, and until the middle of the 20th century, the Bill of Rights didn't apply to the states, and the Supreme Court had never so ruled, and that's with respect to all the Bill of Rights. So there was nothing unique about that. It was not as if somebody suddenly discovered the religion clause and set about to use it to destroy religion in America. It was simply that the Supreme Court started gradually to apply the Bill of Rights to the states. The First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, all the amendments, and that was part of it.
Well, in the first place, with the incorporation clause, which gave them jurisdiction for the first time, or at least not for the first time, when they acknowledged jurisdiction, there was simply no complaints over practices which have, since for fanatical reasons, been denied. And even Justice Douglas, 4 years after the McCulloch decision, said the religion is a basis of virtue in the American people, and therefore Congress has a legitimate interest in stimulating religion. There were all those grants made out in the West Coast to religious institutions.
Well, but that wasn't because the court or anybody else just discovered it. It was because those practices hadn't existed before. I mean, one of the things that Terry McCollum's parents went to court about was because they felt that Catholics were discriminated against by the Protestant religious practices in the public schools, and that was at a time when that first started. There weren't any minorities, or very, very few minorities in the public schools. But during the time when the number of Catholics and Jews in the public schools started increasing, the use of the public school building for religious instruction, which separated out Protestants and Catholics and Jews, and what it always meant was that the Protestant kids and the Protestant teachers stayed in the regular classroom, and the Catholics and the Jews went somewhere else off to the side.
Which is a natural accommodation.
Terry McCollum's mother thought that was discriminatory, and she raised that lawsuit in the late 1940s, and it was because she complained that the court dealt with it. She didn't complain before because it hadn't been done before.
Yeah. Well, my point is that you tend to encourage complaints when they are, even if they are eccentric and lacking in any genuine understanding of the organic nature of society, in which there are cultures, and these cultures observe certain fashions and observe certain taboos. To feel that it is an affront on your rights for those cultures to be expressive, in my judgment.
No, we're not talking about the cultures, Bill. We're talking about the government. When you said a moment ago that you would not see any constitutional problem if American currency had "In our Lord Jesus Christ we trust," I think what you revealed is your willingness to have the government, through its actions and through its endorsements, reflect a majoritarian culture. And
yes,
it is the purpose of the Bill of Rights to insulate people who believe and act differently
I don't
from
think
the
it's true.
imposition. That's what religious liberty
no,
means.
No, the purpose is to guard them against any oppression, against their right to exercise any religion they want to do, or no religion. I feel devoutly this is correct, but this doesn't mean that they have a corresponding right effectively to discourage other people's exercise of religion in public institutions.
The very plain intent, I think, of all of the amendments, I think the intent of the First Amendment is the clearest because it was the subject of the most discussion in the 18th century, was not just to prevent overt oppression. It was to prevent the government from endorsing, being part of, saying, we, the government, are this religion and you are an other. You are a guest in our house. The colonists hated that. The separate Baptists and the Congregationalists and the New Light Presbyterians went crazy.
Yeah.
And that's why we have a First Amendment.
They hated it because it was an expression of the dominant terror of their time. After all, England has an established religion right now.
Actually,
I'm trying to wonder who on earth cares.
Actually, it's not true that it was a dominant terror of their time. Samuel Adams once said in the 18th century that it was the most mild form of establishment he had ever seen because, in fact, there was very little oppression.
Thank you, Mr. Glasser.
Century.
Oh, my goodness. Here's your book. It's being shown anyway. Thank you, Ira Glasser of the ACLU, Visions of Liberty. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of St. John's. Thank you, Mr. Kinsley.
Next week on Firing Line, William F. Buckley Jr. talks with author and columnist Anthony Lewis about his book, Make No Law, which concerns the Supreme Court case of New York Times versus Sullivan. The case revolutionized First Amendment law by giving journalists constitutional protection against libel suits. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, L. John Polite, Jr., and the Friends of Firing Line. For a printed...